There is a specific kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart, it shatters your entire reality. Arthur thought he had it all figured out. He was trading in his quiet, unassuming wife of 7 years for a wealthy, glamorous heiress who could fast-track him to the very top of the corporate ladder. He handed over the divorce papers with a smug, victorious smile, believing he was finally leaving his dead-weight marriage in the dust to claim the fortune and status he deserved. But Arthur made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. The corporate empire he was so desperately trying to marry into, his plain wife already owned it. Arthur Pendleton adjusted the Windsor knot of his crimson silk tie, leaning closer to the hallway mirror to inspect his reflection. At 34, he possessed the sharp, angular features of a man who belonged in corner offices and luxury sedans. He was a senior project manager at Apex Global Logistics, a massive international conglomerate, and he firmly believed he was destined for greatness. He glanced over his shoulder into the modest, open-plan kitchen of their suburban Chicago home. Sitting at the island was his wife, Emma. She was wrapped in an oversized, faded gray cashmere sweater, her chestnut hair twisted into a messy bun secured with a plastic claw clip. She was typing quietly on her laptop, a mug of chamomile tea steaming beside her. To Arthur, Emma was the picture of stagnant mediocrity. When they met in their early 20s, Emma's grounded, unpretentious nature had been a breath of fresh air. Arthur had been a stressed, broke business major. Emma had been a quiet literature enthusiast who seemed entirely content with a simple life. She told him she did freelance consulting for mid-level retail firms. She paid her half of the mortgage on time, she cooked, she listened to his endless rants about office politics, and she asked for very little. But as Arthur climbed the middle management ranks at Apex Global, his tastes had evolved. He no longer wanted quiet evenings watching documentaries. He wanted galas. He wanted reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants where the maitre d' knew his name. He wanted a partner who looked like she belonged on the arm of a CEO. "I'm heading out," Arthur said, checking his Rolex, a gift he had bought for himself when he got his last promotion. "I have a dinner meeting tonight with the regional vice president's team. Don't wait up." Emma looked up, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Good luck, Arthur. I know you've been wanting to get FaceTime with the regional executives. Have a great day." Arthur offered a stiff nod and walked out the door. He didn't notice the complex financial spreadsheets open on Emma's laptop. He didn't know that the freelance consulting she did was actually managing a diversified portfolio worth billions. Emma Mitchell was, in reality, Emma Sterling. Her late father, Jonathan Sterling, had been the ruthless, brilliant founder of Sterling Holdings, the parent company that owned Apex Global Logistics. When Emma was young, her father had warned her about the isolating nature of extreme wealth. "People will love your money, Emma," he had told her on his deathbed. "Finding someone who loves you is the hardest challenge you'll ever face." Taking his words to heart, Emma had chosen to live a completely undercover life. When she inherited the empire 5 years ago, she appointed a trusted proxy board to handle the day-to-day operations while she retained total majority shareholder control. She loved Arthur. She wanted him to feel like the man of the house, to build his own legacy without feeling emasculated by a billionaire wife. She thought she was giving him the greatest gift, true, unbought love. She had no idea that Arthur was currently pulling his BMW into the Apex Global parking garage, his heart racing not for his career, but for a woman named Vanessa Croft. Vanessa was everything Emma was not. She was 28, the daughter of an executive vice president at Apex, and she wore her family's wealth like a weapon. She walked the glass-walled corridors of the company in tailored Chanel suits, her platinum blonde hair perfectly blown out, carrying a Birkin bag that cost more than Arthur's annual bonus. Their affair had started 3 months ago at a corporate retreat in Aspen. Vanessa had zeroed in on Arthur's ambition, feeding his ego with perfectly timed compliments and whispered promises of backdoor introductions to the C-suite. Arthur, Vanessa purred as he stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor. She was leaning against the reception desk, a predatory smirk playing on her lips. You look tense. Wife keeping you up? Arthur chuckled, a cynical, dismissive sound. Hardly. She's just there. Like a piece of old furniture you keep forgetting to throw out. Vanessa stepped closer, trailing a perfectly manicured fingernail down the lapel of his suit jacket. My father is hosting a private dinner at the country club this weekend. The global CEO of Apex is flying in. I can get you a seat at the table, Arthur. But I don't bring married men to meet my father. Arthur's breath hitched. The global CEO. This was the golden ticket. This was the leap from middle management to the stratosphere. All he had to do was cut the dead weight. You don't have to worry about that, Arthur murmured, his eyes locked on hers. I've already made my decision. I'm taking care of it tonight. That evening was Arthur and Emma's 7th wedding anniversary. Emma had spent the entire afternoon preparing a prime rib roast, Arthur's favorite. She had set the dining room table with their good china, lit tapered candles, and chilled a bottle of expensive Bordeaux, a rare indulgence she allowed herself from her private cellar, hoping Arthur wouldn't question the vintage. As she waited, she let her mind wander. Maybe it was time to tell him the truth. Arthur had been working so hard lately, looking so stressed and unfulfilled. He had proven himself. He had stayed with her through 7 years of what he believed was a thoroughly middle-class existence. He had passed her father's invisible test. She imagined the look on his face when she revealed that she could retire him tomorrow, that they could travel the world, that he could run his own division of Apex if he so desired. The front door clicked open at 8:45 p.m. Arthur, you're finally home, Emma called out, stepping out of the kitchen and wiping her hands on a linen apron. Arthur walked in, but he didn't take off his coat. He didn't follow the scent of the roast beef. He walked straight into the dining room, looked at the lit candles, the china, and the wine, and sighed heavily. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion. It was a sigh of profound annoyance. Emma, turn off the oven, blow out the candles. We need to talk. Emma froze, the warmth draining from her face. Arthur, what's wrong? Did something happen at work? Arthur reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He tossed it onto the dining table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud right next to the crystal wine glasses. I'm done, Emma, he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was the same tone he used when terminating a vendor contract at work. I am filing for divorce. Emma stared at the envelope, her mind struggling to process the words. Divorce? Arthur, it's our anniversary. What are you talking about? Are you having a midlife crisis? I'm having a clarity crisis, Arthur shot back, his arrogance flaring. He began pacing the room, finally letting out the resentment he had been bottling up. Look around you, Emma. Look at this house. Look at you. You are perfectly content, living this small, insignificant life. You want to bake roasts and type away at your little freelance gigs until we're 60. I don't. We have a good life, she whispered, her voice trembling. We have each other. That's not enough, Arthur barked. I am destined for the top, Emma. I am moving into the upper echelons of Apex Global. Do you know what kind of world that is? It's galas, it's networking, it's power. I need a partner who understands that world. A partner who can elevate me, not anchor me to the suburbs. Emma's tears stopped abruptly. The sheer cruelty of his words acted like ice water in her veins. A partner who can elevate you, she repeated slowly. You've met someone. Arthur didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He raised his chin defiantly. Yes, her name is Vanessa Croft. Her father is the executive vice president of Apex Global. She was born into the corporate elite, Emma. She understands ambition. With her, I'm going to be sitting on the executive board within 2 years. With you, I'm just a guy who comes home to a pot roast. He pointed to the envelope. The papers are in there. I've been generous. You can keep the house, and I'll pay a lump sum of alimony. I want a clean break. I'm moving my things out tonight. Emma looked at the man she had loved for nearly a decade. She looked past the handsome face and saw the rotting, opportunistic core she had somehow missed. He wasn't leaving her because they had fallen out of love. He was discarding her like a stepping stone because he thought he had found a richer, shinier rock to climb on. A strange, eerie calm washed over Emma. The heartbreak was still there, a jagged wound in her chest, but it was being rapidly sealed by a furious, cold determination. The irony of his speech was so staggering, it almost made her laugh. He was leaving her to marry the daughter of an executive vice president at Apex Global. Her company, Vanessa Croft's father, answered to the CEO, and the CEO answered to Emma. Emma reached out and picked up the envelope. She pulled out the documents, her eyes scanning the legal jargon Arthur had eagerly paid a lawyer to draft. "You're absolutely certain about this, Arthur?" Emma asked, her voice steady and unnervingly quiet. "There is no turning back from this moment. Once I sign these, we are nothing to each other." Arthur scoffed, mistaking her calm for submission. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Emma. Please, don't make this harder than it has to be. Just sign the papers so we can both move on to the lives we actually deserve." "The lives we actually deserve," Emma murmured. She walked over to the sideboard, picked up a heavy silver pen, and signed her name on the final page. She didn't sign it. Emma Pendleton. She signed it, with dramatic, sweeping cursive, Emma Sterling. She slid the papers back into the envelope and handed them to him. "Your bags are in the closet. Pack them. Leave the keys on the counter." Arthur looked momentarily surprised by how easy it was, but his ego quickly rationalized it. Of course she was giving up easily. She knew she couldn't compete with Vanessa Croft. He grabbed the envelope, a triumphant smirk on his face. "It's for the best, Emma. You'll see." He spent 20 minutes packing his suitcases. When he finally walked out the front door, the silence in the house was deafening. Emma stood in the center of the dining room for a long time, watching the candles burn down. Then, she walked over to her laptop. She closed the tabs, featuring recipes and domestic budgets. She opened her encrypted communication portal and dialed a private offshore number. It rang twice before a distinguished, gravelly voice answered. "Emma? It's late. Is everything all right?" "Hello, Richard," Emma said, staring at her reflection in the dark window pane. Richard Hayes had been her father's most ruthless attorney and was currently the acting chairman of the proxy board running Sterling Holdings. "I'm calling to inform you that my sabbatical is officially over," Emma said, her tone as sharp and unyielding as cut glass. "I am stepping out of the shadows. Prepare the paperwork for my immediate instatement as the active CEO and chairman of Sterling Holdings." "And Richard?" "Yes, Miss Sterling, pull the complete employment file on an Arthur Pendleton, senior project manager at Apex Global, and I want a full audit on the Croft family. Every expense account, every email, every deal they've touched in the last 5 years. We are about to do some major corporate restructuring." The Monday morning after the divorce papers were signed, the atmosphere inside the steel and glass monolith that housed Sterling Holdings was electric with a frantic, terrified energy. Rumors had been bleeding through the encrypted company channels since midnight. The heir is returning. For 5 years, Emma Sterling had existed to the board of directors as an abstract concept, a signature on quarterly reports, a ghost who demanded steady, conservative growth, but never set foot in the boardroom. That era was violently over. At 7:45 a.m., a fleet of 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled into the underground VIP garage. When the doors of the private executive elevator opened on the top floor, the proxy board was already waiting in a frantic semicircle. Emma stepped out, and the air in the room seemed to freeze. Gone was the faded cashmere and the plastic claw clip. She was armored in a razor-sharp, midnight blue Tom Ford suit, her chestnut hair blown out into a sleek, intimidating curtain over her shoulders. Her posture was perfectly aligned, exuding the predatory confidence her father, Jonathan Sterling, was legendary for. Richard Hayes, the silver-haired patrician attorney who had acted as chairman, stepped forward and bowed his head slightly. "Welcome home, Miss Sterling. The corner office has been prepared to your exact specifications. Thank you, Richard, Emma said. Her voice was no longer the soft, agreeable murmur Arthur had known. It was crisp, authoritative, and completely devoid of warmth. She walked past the gawking executives without offering a single handshake. Let's get straight to work. I want the CFO and the head of internal audit in my office in 10 minutes. And Richard? Yes, Emma? Tell me you have the Croft file. 10 minutes later, Emma sat behind her father's massive mahogany desk, overlooking the sweeping Chicago skyline. Spread out before her were hundreds of pages of financial forensics. The audit had taken Richard's team all weekend, and the results were more damning than Emma had even hoped. William Croft, the executive vice president of Apex Global Logistics and Vanessa's father, was a thief. He wasn't robbing the vault with a ski mask. He was doing it the corporate way. He had been inflating vendor contracts in the European logistics division and funneling the excess into a web of offshore shell companies. That was how Vanessa afforded her Birkin bags, her Aspen ski trips, and the lavish penthouse Arthur had just moved into. They were funding their extravagant lifestyle with Emma's money. Even more pathetic was Arthur's file. Simon Keller, the head of HR, had brought it up personally. Arthur Pendleton, senior project manager, Simon said, adjusting his glasses nervously. To be frank, Miss Sterling, his performance is incredibly average. He delegates the heavy lifting to his junior analysts and takes the credit during quarterly reviews. He was red-flagged for a promotion last year due to a lack of innovative strategy, but Simon cleared his throat. William Croft personally bypassed the HR block 3 weeks ago and put Pendleton on the short list for regional director. Emma traced the rim of her coffee cup, a cold smile touching her lips. Nepotism built on embezzled funds. How remarkably cliché. Leave the files, Simon. I will handle Mr. Croft and Mr. Pendleton personally. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, in a sun-drenched, glass-walled penthouse, Arthur Pendleton was feeling like a king. He stood on the balcony, sipping a macchiato, looking down at the city traffic. He had won. He had severed the dead weight, and now he was living in the sky. Vanessa walked out onto the balcony, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. She was wearing a silk slip dress, smelling of expensive floral perfume. Did she give you any trouble with the papers? Vanessa asked, resting her chin on his shoulder. Arthur scoffed, taking another sip of his coffee. Emma, please. She practically folded the second I put them on the table. She knows she can't compete with this. She's probably sitting in that depressing suburban house right now, crying into a pot of tea. Vanessa giggled, trailing her hands down his chest. Good, because my father just called. The dinner at the Oakbrook Country Club this Saturday? It's not just the Apex Global CEO flying in. My father says the majority shareholder of the parent company Sterling Holdings is finally stepping out of the shadows. The heir is going to be there. Arthur's eyes widened. The Sterling heir? They never do public appearances. This is massive, Vanessa. If I can get 2 minutes with the owner of the entire empire, you will, Vanessa promised, kissing his cheek. My father is seating us at the VIP table. Just wear your best suit, Arthur. This weekend, your whole life changes. Arthur grinned, pulling her close. It already has. The Oakbrook Country Club was a bastion of old money and exclusionary prestige. By 7:30 p.m. on Saturday, the private grand ballroom was filled with the elite echelons of Apex Global and Sterling Holdings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in heavy white linen, adorned with elaborate centerpieces of white orchids. Arthur adjusted his cuffs, his heart hammering against his ribs in a chaotic rhythm of excitement and nerves. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo he had put on a credit card he could barely afford, desperate to look the part. He stood near the head table next to Vanessa and her father, William Croft. William was a loud, red-faced man who smelled heavily of scotch and expensive cigars. He clapped Arthur aggressively on the shoulder. Listen to me, Pendleton, William boomed, leaning in close. The Sterling heir is ruthless. Jonathan Sterling raised his kid to be a shark. When she arrives, you let me do the talking. I'm going to introduce you as my incoming regional director. You smile, you shake her hand, and you agree with whatever she says. Understand? Absolutely, sir, Arthur said, eager to please. I won't let you down. At exactly 8 p.m., a heavy silence fell over the room as the massive oak double doors of the ballroom were pushed open by private security. Richard Hayes walked in first, his presence alone enough to make the room hold its breath. He stepped to the side, turning to the open doorway. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's booming voice echoed off the gilded ceiling. It is my honor to introduce the chairman of the board, chief executive officer, and majority owner of Sterling Holdings, Miss Emma Sterling. Arthur froze. His brain simply stopped processing information. Through the doorway walked Emma, but it wasn't the Emma he knew. She was wearing a floor-length, backless emerald green gown that looked like liquid glass, her neck adorned with a diamond collar that caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the room like fire. Her makeup was sharp and flawless, her expression a mask of terrifying, aristocratic boredom. The room erupted into polite, reverent applause. William Croft immediately stood up, puffing out his chest, completely oblivious to the fact that the man standing next to him had just stopped breathing. No, Arthur's mind screamed. No, no, no. This is a mistake. This is a hallucination. She followed me here. She rented a dress to make a scene. As Emma glided across the room, flanked by security and Richard Hayes, Arthur's panic overrode his common sense. He broke away from the table, stepping directly into her path. Emma! Arthur hissed under his breath, his face pale, his eyes darting around frantically. What the hell are you doing here? How did you get past security? Are you insane? Emma stopped. The security detail immediately moved to intercept Arthur, but Emma raised a single, manicured hand, halting them. She looked at Arthur. Her eyes, which had looked at him with nothing but unconditional love for 7 years, were now completely dead, regarding him the way one might look at a cockroach on a marble floor. Mr. Pendleton, Emma said, her voice carried, cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Several executives turned to watch. I believe you are standing in my way. Arthur's mouth opened and closed, like a dying fish. Emma, stop this. You're going to embarrass yourself. William Croft is right there. Do you know who these people are? Arthur, who is this woman? Vanessa demanded, marching up behind him, her eyes raking over Emma's incredibly expensive gown with immediate, jealous hostility. Security, why is this woman harassing my boyfriend? Richard Hayes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Miss Croft, you will address the chairman of this company with the respect she commands, or I will have you physically thrown out onto the golf course. Vanessa stumbled back, as if she had been slapped. Chairman? William Croft hurried over, a false, obsequious smile plastered across his face. He aggressively shoved Arthur out of the way. Miss Sterling, welcome, welcome. Please forgive my daughter and this employee. They didn't recognize you. I am William Croft, Executive Vice President. It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person. William extended his hand. Emma looked at it for a long, agonizing moment. She did not take it. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The entire ballroom was now watching. William Croft, Emma said finally, her voice dripping with venom. I am intimately aware of who you are. In fact, I have spent the last 4 days reviewing your creative accounting practices in the European division. William's hand dropped to his side. The blood instantly drained from his red face, leaving him a sickening, ashen gray. I don't know what you mean, Miss Sterling. Emma smiled, a terrifying, carnivorous curve of her lips. Yes, you do. But we won't bore our guests with the details of your impending federal indictment. We can save that for the authorities. She finally turned her gaze back to Arthur, who was shaking visibly, leaning against a chair to keep himself upright. The pieces were finally violently snapping together in his mediocre brain. The freelance consulting, the lack of financial stress, the way she never asked him for money. He hadn't been supporting her. She had been letting him play house in her empire. As for you, Arthur, Emma said, stepping closer to him, the scent of her perfume no longer chamomile and vanilla, but something rich, spicy, and expensive enveloped him. You wanted a partner who could elevate you. You wanted to sit at the executive table. You wanted to marry into the corporate elite. She leaned in, dropping her voice so only Arthur, Vanessa, and William could hear the final, devastating blow. You were already married to the throne, Arthur. But since you were in such a rush to throw it away for a thief's daughter, I've decided to grant your wish. Your divorce is finalized. And as of 8 p.m. tonight, your employment at Apex Global is officially terminated. Please, do enjoy the appetizers. They are on me. Emma didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on the wreckage of Arthur's life and glided toward the head table, the sea of executives parting for her like royalty. Arthur stood frozen, the heavy, crushing weight of his colossal stupidity burying him alive. He looked at Vanessa, who was staring at her father in abject horror, realizing their fortune, their status, and their entire lives were gone. He had traded a billionaire for a bankrupt fraud. The silence that followed Emma's departure from the antechamber of the ballroom was absolute, save for the clinking of crystal and the low, terrified murmurs of the executives who had witnessed the execution. The sea of bespoke suits and designer gowns had parted for Emma Sterling, closing immediately behind her, effectively walling Arthur, Vanessa, and William out of the kingdom. Arthur stood frozen on the plush carpet of the Oakbrook Country Club, the air in his lungs completely stagnant. The chandeliers above seemed to sway, the light suddenly harsh and unforgiving. He looked down at his own hands, trembling uncontrollably against the expensive fabric of a tuxedo he hadn't even paid off yet. Emma, his quiet, unassuming Emma, the woman who bought generic brand paper towels and spent her weekends reading paperback novels on their second-hand sofa. She was the architect of the very universe he had been desperately trying to claw his way into. Dad, Vanessa's voice broke the trance. It was a high, thin sound, stripped entirely of its usual arrogant purr. She clutched William's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his jacket. Dad, what did she mean? What federal indictment? Tell me she's just a crazy, jealous ex-wife making things up. Do something. William Croft did not look like an executive vice president at that moment. The blustering, red-faced titan of industry had vanished, replaced by a hollowed-out, panicked old man. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked frantically toward the head table, where Emma was now seated, flanked by the global CEO and Richard Hayes, both of whom were treating her with the utmost deference. She knows, William whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. God help me, she knows everything about the European accounts. Excuse me, gentlemen, Miss Croft. A towering man, in a discreet black suit, appeared materialized beside them. It was David Brooks, the head of Sterling Holdings' private security detail. His expression was a wall of granite. He gestured toward the heavy oak doors leading out to the foyer. Miss, Sterling has requested that you vacate the premises immediately. Your presence is disrupting the evening. Arthur tried to find his voice. The sheer magnitude of his humiliation was morphing into a desperate, frantic denial. Wait, please. I just need to speak with my wife, my ex-wife, just for 5 minutes. If I could just explain. David Brooks stepped squarely into Arthur's personal space, towering over him. The threat in the security chief's eyes was unmistakable. You do not work for this company anymore, Mr. Pendleton, and you certainly do not have an audience with the chairman. Walk out, or I will have you carried out. The choice is yours. Vanessa's face twisted into an ugly mask of outrage. You can't do this. Do you know who my father is? He's an executive vice president. Your father, David replied evenly, is a trespasser. Move. The walk out of the ballroom was the longest journey of Arthur's life. Hundreds of eyes tracked their exit. These were the people Arthur had spent years trying to impress. The regional directors, the senior partners, the people he had bragged to about his upcoming promotion. Now, they were looking at him, not with envy, but with disgust and pity. He was a pariah, a dead man walking. The humid night air hit them as they were escorted out the front doors and down the grand stone steps to the valet stand. Before Arthur could even process the transition from the glitz of the ballroom to the desolate parking lot, William rounded on him with the fury of a cornered animal. "You idiot!" William roared, spittle flying from his lips as he shoved Arthur hard in the chest. Arthur stumbled backward, his heel catching on the cobblestone. "You absolute colossal idiot. You told me she was a nobody. You told me she was a freelance consultant making pennies. You brought the chairman of Sterling Holdings right to my doorstep and handed her my neck." Arthur threw his hands up defensively, his mind spinning. "I didn't know. I swear to God, William, I had no idea. She hid it from me for 7 years. She lied to me." "She didn't lie to you. She tested you," William bellowed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "And you failed. You brought the wrath of Jonathan Sterling's daughter down on my entire division. The audit. The European contracts. She's going to freeze my assets. She's going to send me to federal prison." Vanessa stood by the valet stand, her eyes wide with mounting terror. The reality of her father's words was finally piercing through her veil of entitlement. "Dad, what are you saying? What about my trust fund? What about the penthouse?" William shot his daughter a look of pure, toxic resentment. "There is no trust fund, Vanessa. It's all gone. The money was in offshore accounts, and if she's been auditing me for 4 days, she's already found it. We are bankrupt." Vanessa let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Arthur, the man she had seduced to secure a loyal lapdog on the executive board, the man she had paraded around as her prize. The glamour was instantly stripped away. He wasn't a rising star. He was an unemployed, broke, discarded husband. "Get away from me," Vanessa hissed, taking a step back as Arthur reached out to comfort her. Her eyes were filled with venom. "Don't touch me, Arthur. This is your fault. If you hadn't brought her attention to us, none of this would be happening." "Vanessa, baby, please," Arthur pleaded, the desperation leaking into his voice. "We can figure this out. I still have my contacts. I can find another job." "Another job?" Vanessa laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound. "You were fired by Emma Sterling in front of the entire industry. You are blacklisted, Arthur. No one will ever hire you again. You're worthless to me." The valet brought William's Mercedes around. William snatched the keys, ignoring the attendant, and got into the driver's seat. Vanessa scrambled into the passenger side, slamming the door shut without giving Arthur a second glance. Arthur stood alone on the cobblestone driveway, the red taillights of the Mercedes disappearing into the night. He had no car. He had taken an Uber to the gala to drink. He reached into his pocket to check his phone, only to see an unread email from Apex Global HR. Subject: immediate termination of employment and benefits. Arthur slowly sank onto the low stone wall bordering the valet stand, burying his face in his hands. The distant sound of string music drifted out from the ballroom, a mocking soundtrack to the absolute destruction of his life. Monday morning arrived, not with the gentle glow of a new work week, but with the brutal, blinding light of an executioner's block. Inside the towering glass skyscraper of Apex Global Logistics, the atmosphere was chaotic. At exactly 7 a.m., a team of forensic accountants from Sterling Holdings, accompanied by 3 stern-faced agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, bypassed the lobby and took private elevators directly to the 42nd floor. William Croft's executive suite was sealed off with yellow tape. William himself was not there. He had been intercepted at O'Hare International Airport at 4 a.m., attempting to board a one-way flight to Geneva. His passport had been flagged, his accounts frozen by federal injunction, and he was currently sitting in a sterile interrogation room, his bluster completely broken. 80 floors above the chaos, in the serene, soundproofed sanctuary of the chairman's office, Emma Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, sipping black coffee. She watched the miniature cars crawling along the Chicago streets far below. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, her demeanor as impenetrable as the glass she stood behind. Richard Hayes entered the office, a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He paused, admiring the ruthless efficiency with which the young woman had taken command of her father's empire. Jonathan Sterling would have been deeply proud. "The board is assembled in conference room A, Emma," Richard announced, his tone respectful. "The SEC agents have secured Croft's hard drives. The paper trail is undeniable. He was siphoning approximately $12 million over the past 4 years. The board is terrified, but they are ready for your directives." Emma turned away from the window, her expression unreadable. "Good. Terminate every vendor contract Croft initiated in Europe. We will absorb the short-term losses and restructure the logistics pipeline by Q3. I want a complete sweep of his department. Anyone who knew about the embezzlement and stayed quiet is to be fired and reported to the authorities." "Consider it done," Richard said, making a note. "And what of Mr. Pendleton?" At the mention of Arthur's name, a brief shadow flickered across Emma's eyes, a phantom ache of a life she had mourned over the weekend. But the grief had been swiftly cauterized by his betrayal. "Arthur is a non-entity, Richard," Emma said smoothly, walking over to her desk and opening a file. "Ensure his severance is exactly 0, citing the morality clause in his contract due to his direct association with Croft's fraudulent activities. Cancel his corporate credit cards and revoke his access to the employee portal. He wanted to build his own legacy. Let him build it from scratch." While Emma was meticulously dismantling the rot in her company, Arthur was experiencing a very different kind of Monday morning. He woke up on the velvet sofa of Vanessa's penthouse. He hadn't slept. His tuxedo was wrinkled and smelled faintly of stale sweat and panic. The penthouse, which had felt like a palace just 48 hours ago, now felt like a very expensive tomb. He heard the sharp clacking of heels against the hardwood floor. Vanessa marched into the living room, her face pale and drawn, dragging 2 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases behind her. She was throwing designer coats over her arm, her movements frantic and jerky. "Vanessa," Arthur rasped, sitting up and rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Vanessa didn't even stop moving. "I'm leaving. My father's lawyer called an hour ago. He was arrested at the airport, Arthur. The feds are involved. They're seizing everything. The bank is foreclosing on this penthouse by the end of the week. My credit cards are already declining." Arthur stood up, panic seizing his chest again. Okay, we just need to stay calm. We can get a smaller place. I'll call some recruiters today. I have a solid resume." "Are you deaf?" Vanessa shrieked, finally turning to look at him. The mask of the glamorous, sophisticated heiress was entirely gone, revealing a terrified, spoiled child. "You don't have a resume, Arthur. You are radioactive. Emma Sterling owns this city's corporate infrastructure. If she says you don't work, you don't work." She zipped up the second suitcase with violent force. "I'm going to my mother's house in Connecticut. She has a separate trust that isn't tied to my father's assets. And you are not coming with me." Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. "Vanessa, you can't just leave me here. I left my wife for you. I gave up everything for you." "You didn't give up anything," she spat back, hauling the bags toward the door. "You threw away a winning lottery ticket because you were too stupid to read the numbers. You were a temporary amusement, Arthur. A middle management toy I thought I could use to annoy my father and get you on the board. You have no money, no job, and no future. Get out of my apartment before I call building security." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the cavernous, empty penthouse. Arthur was alone, truly, spectacularly alone. By noon, the reality of his situation had fully metabolized. His corporate credit card, which he had used to pay for the tuxedo, the fancy dinners with Vanessa, and the deposit on a leased BMW, was deactivated. His personal checking account was dangerously low, as he had spent his savings trying to keep up with Vanessa's lifestyle for the past 3 months. With nowhere else to go, a desperate, pathetic instinct kicked in. He packed a single duffel bag of his clothes and ordered an Uber he could barely afford, directing it to the suburbs, to his old home, to Emma's house. He rationalized it the whole way there. She loved me for 7 years. She has to have some mercy. If I just apologize, if I tell her Vanessa manipulated me, maybe she'll at least let me stay in the guest room until I get on my feet. She's a billionaire. She doesn't need this little house anyway. The Uber pulled up to the familiar, tree-lined street in the quiet Chicago suburb. Arthur stepped out, a rehearsed apology dying on his lips as he looked at the property. There was a massive, commercial-grade moving truck parked in the driveway. A team of professional movers was carrying out the last of the furniture. The faded sofa, the dining table where he had coldly served her divorce papers, the bookshelf, it was all being loaded away. Standing on the manicured front lawn was a real estate agent hammering a sold sign into the grass. Arthur jogged up the driveway, his heart hammering in his throat. Excuse me, what is going on here? Where is Emma? The real estate agent, a brisk woman in a tailored blazer, looked at him with mild annoyance. The homeowner? She vacated the property yesterday. The house was sold in a private, all-cash transaction to a developer. They're tearing it down next week to build a larger property. Arthur stared at the house. The windows were dark. The life he had lived inside those walls was being literally erased from the earth. Did she leave a forwarding address? Arthur asked, his voice cracking. A message? Anything? The agent checked her tablet, shaking her head. No forwarding address. All correspondence was handled through the legal department of Sterling Holdings. If you have inquiries, I suggest you contact their corporate office. The agent turned away to speak to the moving foreman, leaving Arthur standing on the sidewalk. He looked down at his single duffel bag. He looked at the empty house. Then, he looked up at the sprawling, distant skyline of downtown Chicago, where Emma was currently sitting on a throne of unimaginable power, reigning over the empire he had been too blind to see. Arthur Pendleton had wanted to marry rich. He had wanted to cut the dead weight and ascend to the top. And as he stood on the curb with $10 in his checking account, a ruined reputation, and nowhere to sleep, he realized the agonizing truth. He had held the world in his hands, and he had thrown it away for glass. 6 months later, the brutal, biting winds of a Chicago January whipped through the city streets, a stark contrast to the absolute warmth and untouchable power radiating from the top floor of the Sterling Holdings Tower. Emma Sterling sat at the head of a massive obsidian conference table, her presence commanding the room without a single spoken word. She was no longer the woman who baked prime rib roasts in faded cashmere. She was the cover subject of that month's Forbes magazine, the headline reading in bold, unforgiving print, "The Iron Heiress: How Emma Sterling Purged Apex Global and Reclaimed Her Empire." She had spent the last half-year systematically gutting the corruption her father's proxy board had allowed to fester. William Croft was currently residing in a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, serving a 10-year sentence for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Vanessa Croft, stripped of her trust fund and her socialite status, had been last seen working as a personal shopper in a mid-tier department store in Connecticut, entirely cut off from the elite circles she once terrorized. Richard Hayes walked into the boardroom, handing Emma a leather-bound folio. "The acquisition papers for Prime Regional Delivery are ready for your signature, Emma. It's a small courier service in the industrial district, but acquiring their warehouse space gives us complete monopolistic control over the South Side shipping routes." Emma scanned the document with practiced efficiency. She picked up her gold fountain pen, the same one she had used to sign her divorce papers, and elegantly looped her signature across the bottom line. "Have Simon Keller take a transition team down there this afternoon," Emma instructed, closing the folio. "Audit their staff, keep the drivers, but terminate the middle management. I don't want any redundant administrative bloat bleeding our margins." "Understood," Richard said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've done remarkable work, Emma. Your father would be terrified of you." Emma looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling city looking like a miniature chessboard far below. "He taught me that power isn't given, Richard. It's wielded. I just forgot that for a little while. She didn't think about Arthur Pendleton anymore. He wasn't a lingering heartbreak or a painful memory. He was simply a rounding error she had corrected on a balance sheet. She had excised him from her life with the same clinical precision she used to fire a corrupt executive. She was whole, she was thriving, and she was entirely free. 10 miles south, in a dilapidated industrial park, Arthur Pendleton was decidedly not free. The heater in the cramped, fluorescent-lit office of Prime Regional Delivery was broken, and Arthur sat at a chipped laminate desk, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester suit he had bought off a clearance rack. He was shivering, nursing a lukewarm cup of break-room coffee that tasted like burnt copper. His life had become a suffocating loop of humiliation. After being publicly blacklisted by Sterling Holdings, the corporate world had entirely closed its doors to him. Headhunters stopped returning his calls. His LinkedIn profile was a graveyard. To survive, he had been forced to take a job as a shift supervisor at this third-rate courier company, making a fraction of his former salary. He lived in a tiny, drafty studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. His BMW had been repossessed months ago, forcing him to take 2 different buses to get to this miserable warehouse every morning at 5 a.m. Every time he swiped his worn transit card, he thought about the corner office at Apex Global he was supposed to have. He thought about the country club, the bespoke tuxedo, the future he had thrown into an incinerator. "Pendleton!" a gruff voice barked. Arthur flinched. His boss, Gary, a perpetually sweaty man with a permanent scowl, stood in the doorway of the manager's office. "Get in here. Now." Arthur stood up, smoothing down his cheap tie, forcing a compliant smile onto his face. He desperately needed this job. He was 2 months behind on rent, and Gary had hinted at a promotion to operations manager if Arthur could optimize the driver routes. It wasn't the C-suite of a global conglomerate, but it was a lifeline. "Yes, Gary? You wanted to see me?" Arthur asked, stepping into the cramped office that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp cardboard. Gary was packing his desk belongings into a cardboard box. He didn't look up. "Company's been bought out, Arthur. The ink dried an hour ago. We're being absorbed by a massive conglomerate. The transition team from corporate is here to evaluate the staff." Arthur's heart leaped. A massive conglomerate? This was it. This was his backdoor entry back into the real corporate world. If he could impress the transition team, if he could show them his background at Apex Global, omitting the termination, of course, he could climb the ladder again. "That's incredible news, Gary," Arthur said, his old arrogance momentarily flaring to life, straightening his posture. "I can handle the transition. I have extensive experience dealing with large-scale corporate mergers. Who bought us?" Before Gary could answer, the door to the office pushed open. 2 men in impeccably tailored, charcoal-gray Tom Ford suits stepped into the dingy room, looking entirely alien against the backdrop of peeling paint and cheap linoleum. Arthur's breath caught in his throat, turning to solid ice. It was Simon Keller, the head of HR for Sterling Holdings, and David Brooks, Emma's terrifying head of private security. Simon paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Arthur. A slow, deeply amused smirk spread across the HR director's face as he took in Arthur's cheap suit, his exhausted, hollowed-out face, and the bleak, depressing reality of his new life. Well, Simon murmured, his voice smooth and dripping with aristocratic disdain. "If it isn't Arthur Pendleton, I must say, Arthur, I didn't expect to find you hiding in a warehouse on the south side. How the mighty have fallen." Arthur took a step back, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of Gary's desk to stay upright. "Simon, Mr. Keller, what are you doing here?" Gary looked back and forth between them, confused. "You know this guy, Mr. Keller?" "Intimately," Simon replied, not breaking eye contact with Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton used to work for one of our subsidiaries, right up until our chairman, Emma Sterling, personally fired him for his direct involvement with an embezzler." Gary's jaw dropped. He looked at Arthur with immediate disgust. Are you kidding me, Pendleton? You brought a corporate black mark into my business? Gary, please, it's not what it sounds like, Arthur pleaded, the panic rising in his chest like bile. He looked at Simon, his pride completely shattered. Simon, please, I just need a job. I need to pay my rent. I'll stay in the warehouse. I'll work the loading dock. Just don't take this from me. Simon adjusted his cuffs, his expression devoid of a single ounce of pity. Emma had given him specific, blanket instructions months ago regarding any vendor, subsidiary, or partner that employed Arthur Pendleton. You don't seem to understand how this works, Arthur, Simon said coldly. Sterling Holdings now owns Prime Regional Delivery, which means, as of this exact second, you are sitting in a building owned by Emma Sterling, and Emma Sterling does not employ traders. Simon turned to Gary. Mr. Pendleton is terminated, effective immediately, without severance. Have security escort him off the property. David Brooks stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the doorway. The security chief didn't say a word. He just pointed a massive, unyielding finger toward the exit. Arthur's vision blurred with hot, humiliating tears. The walls of the tiny office felt like they were crushing him. There was no negotiation. There was no charm he could use, no lie he could spin. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and Emma held every single key. He didn't say another word. He couldn't. Arthur grabbed his worn winter coat from the back of the chair and walked out of the office, flanked by David Brooks. He walked past the rows of drivers and clerks, his head bowed, carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of his ruin. 10 minutes later, Arthur found himself standing on the cracked, snow-covered sidewalk outside the warehouse gates. The metal doors slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final, definitive judgment. He pulled his thin coat tighter against the freezing wind and looked north. Miles away, towering over the city skyline, the glass spire of the Sterling Holdings building pierced the winter clouds, glittering like a diamond in the pale sunlight. Arthur Pendleton stood in the freezing slush, completely broken, staring up at the empire that could have been his. He had traded a kingdom for a handful of dust, and now he would spend the rest of his life freezing in the shadows of the woman he thought was entirely beneath him. What a spectacular, crushing downfall for Arthur. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, tossing aside a loyal marriage for superficial wealth, only to realize he had handed the keys to the kingdom back to the true queen. Emma's evolution from a quiet, undercover wife to a ruthless, unstoppable CEO is the ultimate masterclass in silent power and poetic justice. Arthur's final realization, standing in the freezing snow, fired from a miserable job by the very empire he tried to steal, proves that betrayal always comes with a devastating price tag. What did you think of Emma's brilliant revenge? Did Arthur get exactly what he deserved, or was his punishment too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of corporate drama, karma, and ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life storytelling.